So my name is Pieter Cleppe. I'm with a British think tank, Open Europe, and I will discuss Brexit to you. So as you could see on TV, the UK last year voted to leave the European Union, which is of course a very great upset. And at the end of March, the UK government, in response to the referendum result, has started the EU's procedure to leave the bloc. What happens next? In the next 2 years, the European Union and Britain have to agree two things. First of all, they have to agree the exit terms of the UK leaving the club. Second of all, they have to agree Britain's status after it has left the European Union. Now, to agree the exit terms in 2 years should not be too hard. What do they have to agree? They have to agree the rights of citizens, and they have to agree the money. The exit bill, the UK has some assets. They own the EU buildings to a certain extent, but of course certain commitments have been made by the EU in terms of funding. So Britain has also promised to pay into that, so they have to figure it out. The European Commission has leaked a figure that the UK would have to pay 60 billion euro, a little bit of exaggerated probably. The UK government has said that in reality they can leave for free, they don't have to pay anything. But they'll find some middle ground there, shouldn't be a big problem. Also important in the exit discussion is the rights of citizens. Can the British who are now in Greece and Spain, can they stay there or not? Can the European citizens that are now in the UK, about 3 million people, can they stay there or not? Well, in Britain there's a lot of concern. Many of these EU citizens are afraid that they're going to be kicked out. I mean, they're absolutely wrong. It's almost certain, almost guaranteed that all British citizens who are now in the EU will be able to stay there for the rest of their lives, and that all EU citizens who are now in Britain will be able to stay there for the rest of their lives, and most likely there will be a deal on that already before the summer. So basically on the exit it should be relatively easy to get to a deal before April 2019, in 2 years' time, when Britain will automatically leave the bloc unless there's an extension, but then you need unanimity of all the EU member states. Now, more problematically is when Britain has left, how will its status look like after it has left the EU? Questions that come to mind is, will British companies still be able to export their goods and services to mainland Europe, and will producers, companies in mainland Europe still be able to produce and export to the UK? That's not guaranteed. It's not guaranteed this will happen in the same easy way as it happens today. There's always been trade between the UK and the continent, so I think optimistically at some point they'll work it out. But the main challenge is that they have to agree some framework on how to do that in 2 years' time, which is very, very short. Now, is there another economy who is not in the European Union, but which has a lot of trade with the EU? Yes, there is. Switzerland. Now, how do EU-Swiss relations work? Very simple. They have committees. So if Switzerland wants to make a new regulation on something, then they have to negotiate with the European Union whether the EU agrees with this regulation. Switzerland can perfectly still, it is a sovereign country, decide this particular law, but if the EU does not agree, Switzerland risks losing market access. So you could have the same framework in the future if the UK say, well, we want to get rid of this problematic EU law on banker bonuses. then the EU may say, well, we don't like that, because then our banks will have to compete, and they they are suffering more stringent EU rules, so this is not fair, and then the UK threatens to lose access to the EU market on that, or not. But that's on the long term. It took Switzerland and the EU 8 years to negotiate that, so 2 years is way too short. What's going to happen in the interim? We have a little bit more clarity on that. The European Commission has leaked that it would perhaps propose to Britain that Britain becomes temporary like Norway. Now, how is the relationship between Norway and the European Union? Norway has full access to the European market. Unlike Switzerland, Swiss services are faced with restrictions, but in return, Norway copy-paste automatically all the EU rules. If Britain would temporarily become like Norway, then of course you can already imagine the Eurosceptics in the UK, Nigel Farage, saying, well, congratulations, Theresa May, we now have even less sovereignty than before. So that may be a bit of an issue. If it weren't for the fact that if Britain would become like Norway, it will not have a right to veto EU legislation. When the EU decides a new law, Norway has to automatically take it over. But Norway does have a right to delay legislation. So basically, if Britain says, okay, we'll become like Norway for 5 years, for 7 years, then effectively they would have a right to delay new EU rules. And effectively, this would be, of course, a veto if you can delay a rule during a period where you take over the rules, but this period is restricted. If the UK would take this offer, it would be able to conclude trade deals, something it cannot do at the moment. It would even have the opportunity to restrict freedom of movement, like Liechtenstein. We had Prince Michael here earlier. Liechtenstein is able to restrict freedom of movement. So this would actually be, I think, quite attractive, perhaps, to the UK if it would only be a short-term arrangement, which would have a clear cut-off date to put pressure on both sides to get to a Swiss-style, long-term, bilateral framework. One issue for the UK, however, would be that it would have to accept the jurisdiction of the EFTA court, which is a supranational court, the supranational court dealing with the relations between the EU and countries like Iceland, Norway and Liechtenstein. It is not as intrusive as the European top court in Luxembourg, but I suspect that may be an issue, but I guess both the UK and the EU will have to compromise somehow, and that's probably why Theresa May, the UK Prime Minister, has called an early election, because Labour is very weak at the moment, so she hopes to have a strong majority, so then she can conclude some kind of a messy deal with the EU, and it's much easier to do that after the election than, of course, just before an election. Maybe before I conclude, two more things. Why did Britain leave? I think there are two main reasons. First of all, the EU, the European communities back in the days, were sold to the UK as a trade arrangement. It turned out that it was actually about a lot more than just trade cooperation on all kinds of policy fields. Secondly, the euro. Britain is not in the euro, but it felt that the EU is more and more turning into a club which was all about the euro, and the euro serving as an excuse to transfer ever more power and money to the European level. How should the European Union react to Brexit? What we can see in the French election, that there's a lot of Euroscepticism, also in mainland Europe. The EU has a lot of good sides. It's a stable trade framework. I think, especially for Montenegro, personally, I think it would be a good idea for the country to eventually join, but I don't think you should rush. It's quite good to have, the politicians being attracted to join the EU and taking some measures. So there's no rush, but eventually I think it could be a good thing for the country. However, there's excessive regulation, there's fiscal transfers within the European Union, so all these things are problematic. And the most problematic thing is, of course, the euro. Now, in this country, I think I would call it one of the best monetary arrangements of the world, because Montenegro uses the euro, but banks in Montenegro do not have access to the cheap money that is printed by the ECB in Frankfurt. Why is that a good thing? Well, if you compare Montenegro and Greece, in Greece the banks got all the cheap money, they passed it on to the politicians, they were buying government bonds. Greece went on to a monstrous debt spree. So easy money is not a good thing, it's a good thing for the politicians, it's maybe a good thing for the economy on the short term. It creates unsustainable investment. So perhaps apart from the EU focusing on only becoming a trade arrangement, I think that's still popular. People want to scrap trade barriers. They want to be able to buy a car in another country, to have competition in airlines, but they don't want the European Union to micromanage national budgets or migration policy. So I think the EU should do that. And specifically for the euro, I think it would be a wonderful thing if every Eurozone member state, except for Germany, would become like Montenegro. So as a result of that, there would be no easy money anymore, and I think a lot of the downsides of the euro would have been solved. So I will leave it there. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Pieter.